Imagine being a woman in Tudor England, where your every word and action were scrutinized, and even your thoughts could cost you your life. What if your beliefs, your faith, and your voice were all that mattered, but in a time when the authorities saw you as a threat for speaking out? This is a tragic and terrifying story of Anne Askew, one of the most courageous and enduring figures in English history. Her execution, one of the most horrific and brutal in Tudor England, was a testament to her unshakable commitment to her beliefs. But what drove into such an extreme fate? And what made her death so unforgettable? Let's unravel the gripping story of Anne Askew and discover why her execution became a defining moment in the struggle for religious freedom and resistance to tyranny. Anne Askew was born in 1521, during a time when England was undergoing monumental changes. The reign of King Henry VIII was marked by dramatic shifts in both politics and religion. Henry's desire to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, set off a chain of events that would change the face of England forever. His break from the Roman Catholic Church and his establishment of the Church of England were not just about his personal life. They were about seizing control over the religious life of the nation. The repercussions of his decision would be felt for generations to come, and they created an environment in which people were forced to pick sides. And Askew was one of those individuals who was caught in the middle of this religious warfare. The Catholic Church, once the dominant religious institution in England, was now challenged by a growing movement of Protestants who rejected many of its practices. And a devout Protestant found herself at odds with both the king and the Catholic authorities, who saw her faith as a dangerous threat. The tension between the old and new beliefs was reaching a boiling point, and for Anne, this had become a matter of life or death. Anne's family background was one of privilege, but her life was not without its struggles. She was born into a wealthy family, but her relationship with her family was strained because of her strong commitment to the Protestant faith. During a time when religious conformity was expected, her insistence on following Protestant teachings made her a target. However, her defiance didn't come from a desire for rebellion. It came from a deep sense of conviction about what she believed to be the truth. As Anne grew older, she became more vocal about her faith. She wasn't content to keep her beliefs to herself, as many others did in fear of persecution, and felt called to challenge the religious system of her time, to call attention to what she saw as the falsehoods of Catholicism. In doing so, she became one of the few women of her time to take an active role in the Protestant Reformation. At this time, religious movements were mostly led by men, and women were often relegated to the background. But Anne was different. She stood up, took action, and spoke out. And for this, she paid the price. The period in which Anne Askew lived was one of extreme religious conflict. On one side, there were the Catholic loyalists who wanted to preserve the old ways and traditions. On the other, there were the reformers, the Protestants, who believed that the Catholic Church had strayed too far from the teachings of Christ and needed to be reformed. But this was more than just a theological debate. It was a fight for power, control, and the future of England. King Henry VIII's personal decisions had set the stage for this dramatic struggle. His split from Rome had not only affected his marriages, but also the political structure of England itself. The king had placed himself as the head of the new Church of England, essentially putting him above the Pope, the leader of the Catholic Church. At the center of this conflict were people like Anne Askew, who refused to align themselves with the new religious order that was being imposed, and, like many of her fellow Protestants, saw the king's creation of a new church as nothing more than a political maneuver, one that ignored the true essence of the Christian faith. Anne's Protestant convictions, influenced by figures like Martin Luther and William Tyndale, were deeply rooted in the belief that every individual should have direct access to God, without the mediation of the church or its hierarchy. She believed the Bible should be available to everyone in their own language, so they could read and interpret themselves, rather than relying on priests to do so. Anne's resistance to the Catholic Church and to Henry VIII's new religious order wasn't something she kept quiet about. She became increasingly vocal, preaching and sharing her views with anyone who would listen. This put her on the radar of the authorities, who saw her as a dangerous figure. Her outspoken nature, made her a prime target for the inquisitors who were tasked with rooting out heresy. In 1545, Anne was arrested, marking the beginning of her descent into the dark and cruel world of Tudor justice. Anne's arrest came swiftly. She had been reported to the authorities by those who were afraid of her influence and power as a Protestant voice in a Catholic-dominated society. When Anne was taken into custody, she was thrown into the Tower of London, one of the most notorious prisons in England. The tower had been used for centuries to hold traitors, criminals, and those who posed a threat to crown. It was not just a place of confinement. It was a place of fear, torture, and death. When Anne entered the tower, she was immediately subjected to the brutal methods of torture that were all too common during this period. The Crown used torture as a tool to extract confessions, and in Anne's case, it was clear they hoped she would betray others and renounce her Protestant beliefs. But Anne, despite the unimaginable pain she was about to endure, was resolute. Her faith and her commitment to the cause of the Reformation were unwavering. The authorities began by using the infamous rack, a device designed to stretch the body until joints were dislocated and limbs were painfully torn apart. The purpose of the rack was simple: to break the will of the victim and force them to confess. Despite being subjected to this horrific torture and remain defiant, she refused to reveal the names of other Protestants or to recant her beliefs. The torture she endured was excruciating, but it only made her stronger in her resolve. Anne's courage during this time would become legendary. She was a symbol of unwavering faith and resistance to the oppressive religious system of the time. But the authorities were not easily deterred. They kept Anne in isolation, trying to break her down mentally and physically. Despite this, Anne refused to give up. She never compromised her beliefs, even when she was faced with the harshest conditions imaginable. After Anne was tortured, she was brought to trial in 1546. The trial was a mere formality. It was never about justice or fairness. The authorities had already decided her fate. She was accused of heresy, a crime punishable by death, and the charges were designed to break her spirit. Her refusal to recant her Protestant views and her open defiance of the Catholic Church made her a dangerous figure in the eyes of the Crown. The trial was swift, and was found guilty of heresy and treason. Throughout the trial, Anne remained composed. She refused to back down, even though she knew what awaited her. When asked to recant, Anne stood firm. She would not betray her faith or her beliefs, no matter the cost. She knew that this was likely her last chance to speak her truth, and she did not waste it. In the face of the king's men and the overwhelming power of the church, Anne stood tall. But it was clear that her defiance had sealed her fate. The authorities were not interested in mercy, and her execution was inevitable. Anne Askew was sentenced to be burned at the stake. This was not a swift or painless death. It was meant to be a public spectacle, a way to instill fear in those who might consider defying the Crown. Anne was led to the public square in Smithfield, London, where the flames would consume her. The journey there was one of humiliation. Anne, who had already endured days of torture, was paraded through the streets in front of a jeering crowd. But despite the insults and mockery, she never faltered. Her eyes were fixed ahead, her face resolute in her faith. When she arrived at the stake, the flames were set, and Anne was bound to the post. As the fire began to consume her, Anne screamed in agony. The flames took hold of her body, but the execution was drawn out and did not die immediately. The flames crept slowly up her body, causing unbearable pain. Her death was not quick, and it was one of the most horrific public executions ever witnessed. The cruelty of her death only magnified her defiance. Even in her final moments, Anne held fast to her faith. The horror of Anne's execution was not just in the physical pain she endured. It was in the symbolism of her death. Here was a woman who had dared to challenge the religious order of her time, and the authorities wanted to make an example of her. But Anne's death had the opposite effect. It inspired countless others who shared her beliefs, and her name became synonymous with courage and resistance to tyranny. Anne Askew's execution, while tragic and brutal, did not mark the end of her story. Instead, it was the beginning of her legacy. She became a martyr for the Protestant cause, and her story would inspire others to continue to fight for religious freedom. Anne's defiance, even in the face of such a gruesome death, became a symbol of the power of individual conviction. She proved that even in the darkest times, when all seems lost, there is still hope for those who stand firm in their beliefs. Her martyrdom would be remembered for generations. Her name would be honored by those who fought for religious freedom and the right to speak one's truth, no matter the consequences. Anne's death was not in vain. It sparked a movement that would grow, and eventually, England would see the full flowering of the Protestant Reformation. The tragic story of Anne Askew is one of the most heart-wrenching and brutal chapters in the history of Tudor England. Her death at the hands of the authorities was not simply the execution of a woman who refused to comply with the religious standards of the time. No, Anne's death was something much deeper. It was a violent demonstration of the lengths to which the state and the church would go to suppress dissent and challenge the status quo. But rather than silencing her, Anne's martyrdom became a powerful symbol of resistance, courage, and unwavering faith. Anne Askew, despite the unspeakable torture she endured and the horrifying nature of her execution, never wavered in her belief that she was doing the right thing. Her commitment to the Protestant faith, in an era when it was dangerous to do so, led her to become a beacon for others who felt oppressed, misunderstood, or silenced by the powers that be. What makes Anne's story even more remarkable is that she was one of the few women in her time who stood up, who dared to publicly defy the established religious and political norms. Women were often expected to stay quiet, to be obedient, and to follow the orders set before them, and not only rejected these expectations, but became a fierce voice for the Reformation in England. Her suffering and eventual execution at the stake were meant to send a message to others who might dare challenge the religious authority of the time, or to those who were not afraid to speak the truth in the face of injustice. Yet, despite the torturous flames that ultimately claimed her life, Anne's spirit did not burn out. The injustices she suffered became the very fuel for a fire of resistance that burned brightly in the hearts of others. Instead of silencing the voices of reformers and Protestants, her death inspired them to continue the fight. It sparked hope in the hearts of those who dreamed of a society where individuals could freely follow their conscience without fear of persecution or death. Anne's legacy did not end with her body. She became a symbol of resilience in the face of oppression. Her courage, her refusal to bend the knee to authority, and her willingness to die for what she believed in have inspired generations of people throughout history. In the years and centuries that followed, her story was passed down, reminding others that standing up for your beliefs, even when it seems like the world is against you, is a cause worth pursuing. The pain of her execution, the horror of being burned alive, cannot be overlooked. It is a testament to the cruelty of the time, but in her suffering, Anne Askew's name has lived on. Her martyrdom was not in vain. It has echoed throughout history, showing the world that the fight for religious freedom, the right to choose one's faith, and the courage to resist tyranny are timeless struggles. She reminds us that while governments and institutions may try to suppress voices of dissent, truth, once spoken, has a way of surviving, growing, and spreading. Anne Askew's story is not just about the past. It is a story that resonates today. In a world where people still face persecution for their beliefs, Anne's life reminds us of the importance of standing firm in our convictions, especially when they are challenged by those in power. Her sacrifice shows us that while we may face adversity, our actions have the potential to leave a lasting impact long after we are gone. The story of Anne Askew teaches us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the strength to move forward despite it. Anne Askew's story reminds us to stand up for our beliefs, speak out against injustice, and never succumb to tyranny. Her legacy calls us to be brave and steadfast, fighting for what's right. If inspired, subscribe to learn more untold stories that shape our world. Thank you for watching.